Poor boy rejects money from a millionaire, and what he asked for made the millionaire burst into tears. Thomas awoke before dawn, as he did every morning, in the small room he shared with his father, Charles. The walls were simple, covered in old wallpaper that was starting to come off in some spots, revealing the plaster behind. The air was freezing, and the thin blanket wasn't enough to ward off the early morning chill. Thomas got out of bed slowly, careful not to make any noise and avoid waking his father, who was sleeping lightly and restlessly. Charles had been ill for months, and treatment required expensive medicine. This had forced Thomas to mature quickly, turning him into a kind of child adult, full of responsibilities that no child should have. He got dressed quickly, putting on his worn-out t-shirt and already tight sneakers. As he packed the bag with the fruit he would sell at the market, Thomas glanced at his father, who was coughing softly in his sleep. Charles's face was pale and tired. Even with his eyes closed, he looked tense. Thomas knew the money he made from sales barely covered the costs of the medicine, but he had to keep trying. With the bag full, Thomas left the house in silence. The sun had not yet risen, and the streets on the outskirts were shrouded in a fine mist, giving a melancholy tone to the morning. He quickened his pace, his thoughts flooding with worry. When would his father get well? When he could just be a kid without so many responsibilities? But he soon pushed those thoughts away. There was no time to get lost in daydreams. Upon arriving at the fair, the atmosphere was different. Life was already pulsing in that open-air market. Marketers ran to set up their stalls, shouting to get the attention of customers who, even so early, began to fill the place. Thomas smiled to himself. That was one of the few occasions where he truly felt part of something bigger, where he could forget his problems, even if just for a moment. "Good morning, Thomas." "Are you already here?" exclaimed Donna Marlene, a lady with gray hair and kind eyes who was selling vegetables at the stall next door. "Good morning, Donna Marlene." "As always, right?" "Fruits don't sell themselves," he replied, trying to hide the tiredness in his voice. Carefully, Thomas arranged the fruits, placing the freshest ones at the front. He had learned the art of selling naturally, with a sincere smile and special attention to customers, which earned everyone's trust. Even those who didn't buy made a point of praising his effort and determination. "These apples are beautiful today, Thomas." "I'm going to take some home," commented an elderly man as he held the fruits with shaking hands. "You can take it, Geraldo. I'm sure you'll like it." "I will make a special price for you," said Thomas, packing the fruits carefully. The movement at the fair was intense, with people walking back and forth and constant conversations in the background. Thomas continued to focus on sales until something unexpected caught his attention. Amidst the commotion, a metallic and accelerated sound echoed through the street. Turning towards the source of the noise, he saw an out-of-control car coming at high speed down the narrow street, honking wildly. It appeared that the driver had lost control. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He stretched out, trying to get a better look at what was in front of the vehicle, and then he saw a girl, probably around his age, standing right in the middle of the street, distracted with her cell phone in her hands. She did not notice the danger that was quickly approaching. The runaway car was already very close. Time seemed to slow down. Without thinking, Thomas dropped the fruit he was holding and ran as fast as his legs could carry him, feeling the adrenaline pumping through his body. When he was just a few steps away from the girl, he reached out and grabbed her wrist firmly, pulling her out of the way. The car passed so close that the wind ruffled her hair. Thomas and the girl fell to the ground, her face in shock, not understanding what had just happened. The impact of the moment caused the surrounding people to stop. Some ran to help, while others just stared, mouths open. You saved me," the girl murmured, her eyes wide with disbelief. Before Thomas could respond, a tall, well-dressed man with carefully combed gray hair came running out of the crowd. It was Robert, the girl's father, who, upon seeing the scene, collapsed in relief and concern. He kneeled down next to his daughter and pulled her into a tight hug, still not believing what had happened. "My God, Aurora! Are you well? You weren't hurt?" Robert asked, his voice full of emotion. "I'm fine, Dad. I didn't even see the car." "If it weren't for him," said Aurora, looking at Thomas with admiration. Robert stood up, his eyes shining with gratitude, and turned to Thomas. "Boy, you saved my daughter. I don't even know how to thank you." He quickly took his wallet out of his pocket, took out a wad of bills, and handed it to Thomas. "Please accept. It's the least I can do." Thomas looked at the money but felt a lump in his throat. That didn't feel right, he hadn't done it for money. Looking at Robert, he replied firmly, still trying to recover from the shock, "I can't accept it, sir. I just did what needed to be done." Robert was silent for a moment, confused. He insisted, trying to push the money to the boy, but Thomas backed away. "If you want to help me, there is something more important than money," he said, taking a deep breath. "My father is very sick, and I just need to get him the right treatment. Medicines are too expensive." Thomas's words hit Robert like an unexpected blow, and the expression on his face changed instantly. He looked at the boy as if he saw a version of himself from many years ago. The silence between them was broken only by the distant sound of the fare. Robert stood still, watching the boy in front of him. Thomas's words echoed in his mind, bringing back memories he had buried long ago. That humility, that determination, it was impossible not to identify with the boy. Robert, still holding the money, put the bills back in his wallet, feeling that Thomas's request went far beyond any amount of money. "What's your father's name?" asked Robert, now in a calmer tone. "Charles," replied Thomas, still cautious, not knowing what to expect from this situation. "He was a mechanic. But now he can barely get out of bed. I'm doing what I can to get the medicine, but it's difficult." Robert took a deep breath. Memories of his own childhood came flooding back, memories of the difficulties he faced with his family. He knew well what it was like to struggle to survive, to make sure a loved one had the bare minimum. His gaze softened, and he placed his hand on Thomas's shoulder, firmly but gently. "You have admirable courage, Thomas, and I understand what you are going through more than you know. If you allow me, I will help your father in the right way. I have resources that can do much more for him than you could do alone." Thomas frowned, still unsure of what Robert meant by that. "Do you want to help my father?" he asked, hesitantly, not completely believing what he was hearing. "Yes. Not just with the medicine, but with the complete treatment. I own a hospital in the city, and I can ensure he receives the best care possible." Robert smiled when he saw the surprise on Thomas's face, who seemed to struggle to understand the scale of the offer. "And besides," Robert continued, "you need to go back to school. A boy your age shouldn't have to worry about so many things." Thomas blinked, surprised by the unexpected generosity. Study? Hospital? It was a lot to process at once. Until minutes ago, he was selling fruit to survive. Now, suddenly, an opportunity arose that could change his life and that of his father. "But, what if my father doesn't get better? What if I can't pay later?" asked Thomas, the fear of creating false hopes already taking over his mind. He didn't want to hold on to an impossible promise. Robert shook his head with a serene look. "Don't worry about it. You just need to trust. Your father will receive the care he needs, and you will have the chance to live your childhood as you should. There is much more to life than the responsibilities you carry now." Aurora, who had been silent until then, looked at Thomas with an encouraging smile. "It's going to be good, Thomas. I go to a great school, and you can go with me. I can help you adapt. You'll see that everything will get better." Aurora's kind words tried to ease the weight of that decision. Thomas looked at her, still trying to assimilate the situation. The girl's caring tone was comforting, but the fear of disappointing his father and himself continued to weigh on him. Even so, something inside him said that perhaps this was the chance he had been waiting for so long, even without knowing how to accept this new reality. I don't know what to say," Thomas began, his voice shaking with emotion. "If you can really help my father, I'll accept. I just want to see him well again." Robert smiled, relieved. "Good. Let's get this over with, Thomas. Let's make sure your father gets the best treatment and that you have the chance to be who you're truly meant to be." Robert turned around, taking his cell phone from his pocket. "I'm going to make some calls right now. Within the hour, a medical team will be at your house. Everything will start to change." Thomas could hardly believe what he was hearing. Everything was happening too fast. He stood there, watching Robert talk to someone on the phone, arranging everything immediately. Aurora, by her side, maintained a soft smile, looking at Thomas with empathy. "You did something amazing today," Aurora said in a calm voice. "You saved my life, and now your father will also have the chance to be saved. That's destiny, don't you think?" Thomas looked at her, still with confused thoughts, but feeling a spark of hope light up inside him. "I just did what anyone would do," he replied, not wanting to exaggerate what he had done. Aurora laughed softly. "Maybe, but either way, I'm glad it was you. Now let's make everything work out for your father." A short time later, Robert hung up the phone and spoke to Thomas again. "Everything is already arranged. The medical team will be at your house in an hour. Will you take me there so we can meet your father?" Thomas nodded, still stunned by the sudden turn of events. That would be the beginning of a new journey, one he had never imagined living. Thomas walked alongside Robert and Aurora through the streets that led to his house. Silence hung between them, only broken by the distant sounds of the fair behind. Thomas kept his gaze fixed on the cobblestone floor, his thoughts too confused to form words. Robert's proposal was unbelievable, but still, a part of Thomas couldn't allow himself to believe it completely. Life had been so hard that he no longer knew if he could trust good news without expecting something to go wrong soon after. Robert, on the other hand, was watching the boy carefully. There was something about Thomas that touched him deeply. Maybe it was the courage or determination he saw in the boy, or perhaps a reflection of his own past. As a young man, Robert also knew the harshness of life, but luck smiled on him after years of struggle. He knew what it was like to struggle to survive, and that made him want to help Thomas in a way that was more than charity. Aurora walked a few steps behind, quietly observing the landscape that was slowly changing. The streets on the outskirts were very different from her reality, and this made her reflect on how unfair life could be for some. She felt a mixture of admiration and compassion for Thomas, and something inside her wanted to help him, not just because of what he had done for her but because, in some way, it seemed like the right thing to do. Arriving at Thomas's house, Robert couldn't help but notice the state of the small building. The walls were made of exposed brick, some cracks spread along the edges, and the roof looked like it needed urgent repairs. It was a humble home, with a small, unkempt garden in front. Thomas stopped in front of the door, taking a deep breath before entering. He still wasn't sure how his father would react to all this news. "This is where we live," Thomas said with a shy tone in his voice. He opened the door slowly, revealing the simple interior of the house. The space was cramped, with old and worn furniture, but everything was clean and well organized. The smell of herbal tea wafted from the kitchen, where a kettle was slowly boiling on the stove. Robert observed the place with a respectful look. "Your place has a lot of soul," he commented, admiring every detail. "Sometimes what matters is not the size or the luxury, but the love and effort we put into what we have." Thomas smiled, grateful for Robert's words. He knew the house was far from perfect, but it was all he and his father had. He approached the room where Charles was resting and carefully knocked on the door. "Dad, it's me." "I'm here with a friend," Thomas said, opening the door slowly. The room was small and dimly lit, with just a single bed and a small table next to it. Charles was lying down, his eyes were half open and his breathing was still heavy, but he smiled when he saw his son enter. Even though he was overcome by illness, there was a sparkle in his eyes that showed how much he loved and was proud of Thomas. "Friend?" Charles repeated, with a hoarse voice, trying to sit up in bed, but without enough strength. Thomas hurried to help him, supporting his father carefully. Robert, who was watching the scene closely, approached. "Charles, my name is Robert," he began in a calm tone. "I found out about your situation from Thomas, and I want you to know that I will help you recover. I will ensure that you receive the best medical treatment, and your son will be able to study without worrying about anything else." Charles looked from Robert to Thomas, still trying to process what he was hearing. "But I can't afford it," he said, his voice low and tired, as if every word was an effort. Robert smiled gently and shook his head. "I'm not asking for anything in return. I want to do this because you deserve it, and Thomas is an amazing boy. He saved my daughter's life today. It's the least I can do to repay you." Charles looked at Thomas, his eyes teary. "I always knew my son was special, but hearing from a stranger the recognition of Thomas's courage made tears finally roll down his face." He tried to speak, but emotion stopped him. Thomas, in turn, felt a lump in his throat when he saw his father so emotional. "It's going to be okay, Dad," Thomas said, trying to contain his own shaky voice. "You will get better, they will help you." Aurora, who was watching everything from the corner, felt her heart sink when she witnessed that love between father and son. Even with all the safety and comfort in which he had always lived, he had never witnessed anything so intense. She knew her father was right in wanting to help that family. While they were talking, a medical team arrived at the house, bringing equipment and medicines. The professionals examined Charles carefully and professionally while Robert explained the situation. The small room became even more cramped as the doctors moved around, but Thomas watched everything with a mixture of relief and nervousness. It was hard to believe that, after fighting alone for so long, there were now people who could truly change the situation. "It's going to be okay," one of the doctors said after checking Charles's vital signs. "With proper treatment, he has a great chance of recovery." The doctor's words were an immense relief for Thomas. He looked at Robert, who was at his father's bedside, watching everything with a serious but also hopeful expression. Thomas knew he still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was no longer alone. Charles, still emotional, held his son's hand tightly. "You are my strength, Thomas," he said, his voice broken. "I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me." Thomas squeezed his father's hand, holding back the tears that insisted on coming out. "I just did what I had to do, Dad. Now it's your turn to get better. We're going to get out of this together." Robert, watching the familiar scene, felt something he couldn't fully explain. There was a connection between that family and his that went beyond gratitude. He didn't know exactly what it was, but he knew he needed to keep helping. That was just the beginning. As the days went by, Thomas's house began to be frequented by doctors and nurses from Robert's team. Charles's treatment had begun, and the first reactions to his new medication regimen brought signs of hope. Thomas, despite still worrying about his father's health, began to experience a new reality. The long mornings of work at the fair were replaced by hours of study, something he hadn't done in a long time. Robert had kept his promise, offering not only full treatment to Charles but also ensuring that Thomas returned to school. He enrolled him in one of the best schools in the city, the same one Aurora studied at. But for Thomas, school was a bigger challenge than he imagined. Accustomed to the simple routine and humble reality, he felt the weight of exclusion on the first day. That morning, Aurora was by his side, walking with him to school. Thomas wore simple clothes, which contrasted with the other students' impeccable uniforms and designer backpacks. Upon entering the building, he felt judgmental looks and heard whispers around him, not looks of curiosity but of disapproval. Each step seemed more difficult than the last. "Don't worry about them," Aurora said, trying to cheer him up. "Most people here are spoiled and don't know half the things you've been through. If they look at you the wrong way, it's only because they don't understand." Thomas smiled, but the knot in his stomach persisted. Walking through the halls, he heard low comments that hit him like blows. "Who is this? It looks like something out of a poor man's movie," muttered a tall boy with a group around him. "Does he know what a real school is?" A girl with blonde hair replied, laughing cruelly. Thomas swallowed hard, trying to ignore the words echoing in his mind. He was used to facing challenges, but this kind of cruelty was new to him. Aurora gave the group a warning look, but they continued on, unconcerned. In the classroom, the environment was no better. Thomas sat alone at one of the last desks, while the other students seemed to make a point of keeping him on the sidelines. Aurora, trying to help, sat next to him, but knew that Thomas's adaptation would not be easy. The differences between him and the others were evident, and this fueled prejudice. Even so, Thomas tried to focus on the content, looking for a distraction. He always liked learning, and now that he had this opportunity, he wanted to do his best. The literature teacher, a tall man with a deep voice, entered the room with books in hand and announced the theme of the day, life stories. Each student should share something about their own story. Most received the proposal with enthusiasm, talking about trips, luxurious homes, their families' cars, and experiences that Thomas could barely imagine. The more stories he heard, the more out of place he felt. That reality seemed so far from yours. When Thomas's turn came, silence took over the room. All eyes turned to him, waiting for what this simple boy had to say. Thomas took a deep breath, feeling his heart racing, but he knew he needed to be honest. There was nothing to lose. "My name is Thomas," he began, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't have much to tell about travel or interesting things. In fact, until recently, I didn't even know if I would be able to continue studying. I sold fruit at the market to buy medicine for my father, who was sick. He still is." Thomas paused, looking at the faces in front of him. "I'm not like you, but I'm here because one person gave me a chance. And this chance is what makes me believe that everything can change." The room was completely silent. The teacher, visibly moved, made a gesture encouraging Thomas to continue. "I know I don't seem to fit in here," he continued, meeting the surprised looks. "But I'm not here to impress anyone. I just want to learn. Who knows, in the future, I can help my father and other people who went through what I went through." Aurora, sitting next to him, smiled proudly, while some of her colleagues began to get emotional. Thomas's words were intense, revealing a strength and courage that none of them imagined existed there. This wasn't just a life story, it was a reminder that while some fight for more, others fight just to survive. The professor, his eyes shining, gently broke the silence. "Thomas, thank you for sharing your story with us. This is more than a life lesson, it is a demonstration of true courage and resilience." The colleagues who previously looked at Thomas with indifference now had a different expression on their faces. There was no longer contempt or disinterest, but respect. Thomas, who had entered that school feeling out of place, began to realize that true strength was not in the clothes he wore or the money he had, but in the determination to move forward, despite all the difficulties. When the class ended, some students approached, still speechless but with looks of recognition. One of them, with shaking hands, touched Thomas's arm and said softly, "I didn't know. I'm sorry about before." Thomas just nodded, not holding a grudge. He knew the path would be difficult, but, for the first time, he felt that perhaps he could begin to be seen differently. Aurora, at his side, looked at him with a wide smile. "I told you, they just needed to really get to know you. Thomas smiled back, feeling a little more at ease. It's still going to take some time for me to get used to all of this, but I think I can do it. For the first time since stepping foot in that school, he began to believe that maybe he was right. Time passed, and things began to fall into place for Thomas. Although there were still glances and occasional whispers, her story touched the hearts of many. He was now part of small study groups, and some students who had previously ignored him began talking to him during breaks. Aurora was always close by, ensuring that Thomas had the support he needed to face this new environment. The friendship between the two grew stronger as the days went by. However, despite the new world that was opening up at school, Thomas's main concern was still his father. Charles continued treatment, and although doctors assured him that he was improving, recovery seemed slow. Each night, Thomas would go to his father's room and talk about his day, describing his classes, his new friends, and even the challenges he faced. Charles listened carefully to everything, sometimes closing his eyes out of tiredness but always smiling when he heard his son's voice. "You're growing up, Thomas. I'm so proud of you," said Charles one night, his voice weak but full of tenderness. He reached out and touched his son's face, trying to hide the worry he felt. "Soon I will be better, and we will be able to return to normal life." Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He knew his father was trying hard to recover, but the idea of returning to normal life scared him. The hard work at the fair, the financial difficulties, everything seemed so distant now that I was beginning to envision a different future, something I had never imagined possible. That night, after putting his father to rest, Thomas stayed awake longer, reflecting on everything that had happened so far. "I couldn't shake the feeling that something big was about to change, but I didn't know exactly what it was. It was as if his life was at a crossroads, and every step he took him in a new direction." The next day, upon arriving at school, Aurora met him at the gate, as usual. They walked to class together, talking about the week's homework and upcoming school activities. "Hey, Thomas, there's something I've wanted to ask you for a while," Aurora said suddenly, with a curious look in her eyes. "You never talked much about your family. I only know about your father. Do you have any other relatives?" The question took Thomas by surprise. He never talked about it, not with Aurora, not with anyone. The fact was that for as long as he could remember, it had just been him and his father. There were no grandparents, uncles, or any other relatives around. "In truth, no. It's just me and my dad. I never met my mother, and my father doesn't talk much about the rest of the family," Thomas replied, trying not to sound uncomfortable about the subject.
Before we continue, I need to tell you something amazing. Do you want to attract a lot of money into your life? Learn how to do it with the secret content that I will leave in the first pinned comment, and start transforming your financial life. Let's continue.
Aurora frowned, as if she were thinking about something important. "It's strange, right? I always thought that we have more family out there, even if we don't know where." Thomas shrugged, trying to end the conversation. "Maybe, but for me, only my father matters." Throughout that day, Aurora's words kept echoing in Thomas's head. He had never thought much about his family, other than his father, but curiosity was now beginning to grow. Who were your grandparents? Did he have uncles or cousins somewhere? And why didn't his father ever talk about it? While Thomas was dealing with these thoughts, Robert was also searching for answers. He had been following Charles's treatment closely and had become deeply attached to the boy's family. However, something in Charles's past intrigued him. There was a lingering feeling that he knew this man from somewhere but couldn't remember where. Robert had asked an investigator friend to do more in-depth research on Charles. "I knew this might sound invasive, but I felt it was important. There was something in that story that needed to be clarified, something that urged him to look beyond the surface." Days later, while Robert was in his office, the phone rang. It was the investigator. "Robert, I found something you're going to want to see," said the voice on the other end. "It turns out that your friend Charles is not so unknown after all. In fact, he has a much closer connection with you than you realize." Robert was silent, his heart beating faster. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice tense. "Charles, he's your brother," said the investigator. "His name was different when you were kids, but after you broke up, it changed. I'm sure it's him. The dates match, the photos." The revelation fell on Robert like a bomb. Your brother. The brother from whom he had been separated as a child due to family quarrels and financial difficulties. He could hardly believe it. Childhood memories came flooding back, flooding his mind with images of a time long gone, of an old pain he had forced himself to bury. Without thinking twice, Robert picked up the phone and dialed Thomas, asking him and Charles to come to his house that same night. I knew this was a conversation that couldn't wait. When Thomas arrived home that afternoon, he found his father already sitting at the table, something he hadn't seen in months. "Thomas, Sir Robert wants to see us tonight," said Charles, not quite understanding the reason for the invitation. Thomas nodded without question. He knew that, somehow, Robert was involved in something important, and, even though he didn't know what it was, he trusted him. That night, when Thomas and Charles arrived at Robert's house, the atmosphere seemed different. Robert received them with an expression that mixed surprise and emotion. He approached Charles, his eyes glistening with tears he was trying to hold back. "Charles, we have an ancient history. A story you may not remember, but I remember very well," Robert began, his voice wavering. "We were children, we were separated. You are my brother." Robert's words hung in the air, heavy, as if they had the power to stop time. Thomas looked at his father, unable to fully understand what he had just heard. Charles, for his part, seemed frozen in place. His eyes were fixed on Robert, but there was a haze of confusion and disbelief in them. The seconds passed, and the silence between them only increased. Thomas, feeling his heart pounding in his chest, finally broke the silence. "Dad, what is he saying? Are you Sir Robert's brother?" Thomas's voice was low and hesitant, as if he were afraid of the answer. Charles, still dazed, blinked several times, as if trying to process the revelation. He looked like he was about to speak, but the words wouldn't come out. His eyes were watery, and he was breathing hard, as if he had been thrown back into a past he had long tried to forget. Robert took a step forward, trying to ease the tension. "Charles, I know this is a lot to process. It took me a while to believe it too," Robert said, his tone gentle and reassuring. "But I found the evidence, the dates, the photos. And when I saw you for the first time, something inside me told me that I knew you. I just didn't know where until now." Charles's gaze finally broke away from the fog and rested more firmly on Robert. He passed his hand over his face, trying to contain the tears that insisted on appearing. "Are you, yourself, Robert? My brother?" His voice was hoarse, full of repressed emotion. Robert nodded, with tears in his eyes. "Yes, it's me. We were separated so many years ago. Our parents died, and life threw us on opposite sides. I never knew what happened to you." Charles shook his head, fighting not to give in to the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. "I didn't know either. They put me in a foster family, and from there things were difficult. I changed my last name to forget, to try to start over. But, Robert, I never forgot you." Thomas, who was watching the exchange, felt a mixture of shock and hope rise within him. He had never imagined that his family could be bigger than him and his father, and suddenly there was, before his eyes, a story that he didn't know, but that seemed destined to come to light. He stepped forward, looking from Robert to Charles, not knowing what to say. The excitement in the air was palpable. Robert moved closer, placing his hand on Charles's shoulder with an expression of genuine affection. "We wasted so much time, my brother, but now we can start again. We can be a family again." Charles let out a low sob, the emotional barrier finally giving way. Tears streamed down his face as he leaned in to hug Robert. It was a silent hug, but one that carried years of pain, separation, and unexpressed longing. Thomas stood still, watching that moment, feeling his heart fill with something he couldn't name. It was as if all of the difficulties he and his father had faced were suddenly put into perspective. Aurora, who was there observing the scene, felt a lump in her throat. She always knew something special surrounded this family, but the magnitude of what was happening touched her deeply. She approached Thomas, smiling at him confidently. "Looks like you got more than you thought," she said softly. Thomas looked at Aurora, his eyes shining with tears he was trying to hold back. I don't even know what to say. This is all very." He took a deep breath, trying to process the flood of emotions that enveloped him. Robert and Charles finally broke away from the hug, but they were still holding hands, as if they feared the connection would break if they let go. Robert, still with his voice cracking, looked at Thomas. "Thomas, that means you're my nephew. And even without knowing it, I already admired you a lot. You have incredible strength, boy." Thomas, emotional, didn't know what to say. He just smiled, still a bit in disbelief. His world, which had previously seemed so small and full of limitations, now seemed to expand before his eyes. And at the center of it all was his father, a man he had always seen as his only support but who was now connected to a much larger story. Charles, catching his breath, looked at Thomas with a mixture of pride and regret. "I should have told you more about the past, son, but the pain was too great. I never thought I would meet my brother again." Thomas approached his father, taking his hand affectionately. "Dad, it's okay. I know you did what you thought was best. And now we can move on." Robert, wiping the last tears from his face, smiled at them both. "You are no longer alone. From now on, we will take care of each other. I want you to know that my home is your home. We are a family, and I want that connection to never be lost again." The atmosphere seemed charged with emotion but also with a sense of relief. The pain of the past did not disappear but was softened by the promise of a future together. Aurora, next to Thomas, felt an even deeper connection with him, as if their fates were intertwining in a much greater way than she could ever imagine. Thomas looked at his father, his newfound uncle, and Aurora. For the first time, he felt that there was a new horizon opening before his eyes. It was no longer just him and his father against the world, now he had a bigger family, people who cared and were ready to face whatever came their way. At that moment, amid the tears, hugs, and smiles, Thomas realized that life, despite its unexpected twists and turns, was giving him a chance to start over, to live something he had never dreamed of. And with that came the certainty that the future, however uncertain it was, would bring many other discoveries and moments of togetherness that he would never forget. The days following the big reveal were a whirlwind of emotions for Thomas, Charles, and Robert. The reality that they were no longer alone began to set in, and for the first time they felt like they could leave the past behind. Robert's hospital cared for Charles with more dedication than ever before, and he showed steady improvement, slowly returning to the life he longed for. Thomas, in turn, was increasingly integrated into the school and his new routine. That morning, he was preparing for another day of classes, but there was one difference. When he left the house, he found Robert standing at the door, with a smile on his face. "Can I walk you to school today?" the uncle asked with a light tone. Thomas was surprised but smiled back. "Of course, uncle. It will be good." As they walked together through the streets that Thomas now knew well, Robert couldn't help but notice how much his nephew had matured. There was something special about that boy that touched him deeply. Silence reigned for a while, until Robert finally broke the silence with a question that had been floating around in his mind for days. "Thomas, have you thought about what you want to do in the future? I know everything has changed suddenly now, but do you have dreams beyond school?" Thomas looked at his uncle, feeling the weight of the question. The truth was that, until recently, he could barely give space to the dream. His concern was that his father would be okay, but now, with the doors opening, he began to consider possibilities that had never crossed his mind before. "I don't know, Uncle," he began thoughtfully. "I always thought I would spend my life helping my father, maybe working at the fair or something. But now, with all this going on, I feel like I have a chance to do something different. I just don't know what." Robert nodded, understanding. "I understand. When I was your age, I didn't know what I wanted either. The important thing is that you now have choices, and that's more than most people do. Whatever you decide, Thomas, I'll be here to support you." Thomas smiled, feeling comforted by his uncle's words. There was something reassuring about knowing he didn't have to face the future alone. They continued walking, talking about trivialities, until they reached the school. Aurora was there, as always, waiting for Thomas at the entrance. "Hi, Thomas." "Hi, Mr. Robert," Aurora said, smiling when she saw the two of them together. "Hi, Aurora," replied Thomas with a sincere smile. "That's my uncle. He wanted to accompany me today." Aurora looked at Robert in surprise. "Uncle? Ah, so that's why you've been so mysterious these past few days." "Yeah, I'm the lost uncle. I think my fame precedes me," said Robert, laughing as he looked at Thomas and Aurora fondly. "Good, I'll let you go to class. Enjoy the day." As Robert walked away, Aurora looked at Thomas curiously. "So how is this all going? It must be crazy to find out you have a millionaire uncle." Thomas laughed nervously, still trying to get used to the idea. "It's weird, to be honest. I never thought my life would change like this, but I'm starting to get used to it." Aurora gave Thomas a light push on the shoulder, smiling. "It's going to be quite an adventure. And it looks like you won't face anything alone anymore." The two entered school together, and the day followed its usual course. But Thomas couldn't stop thinking about Robert's words. For the first time, he allowed himself to dream, to think about a future that was not limited by the circumstances that surrounded him. The idea of having a world of possibilities before you was both exciting and terrifying. Back home that night, Thomas sat next to his father, who was reading a newspaper in bed, something he hadn't done in a long time. Charles seemed stronger every day, and it brought Thomas a comfort he didn't know he needed. "Dad, have you thought about what you want to do when you get better?" Thomas asked, feeling the moment was appropriate. Charles lowered the newspaper and looked at his son with a slight smile. "I've been thinking about this a lot, son. I think when I'm well enough, I want to go back to working as a mechanic. Not out of necessity, but because I like it. And I also want to enjoy time with you more. I feel like I've missed out on a lot of things in the last few years." Thomas felt a tightness in his chest when he heard his father's words. He knew that Charles carried the weight of his illness with a certain sense of guilt, as if being sick had taken something away from them. But Thomas never blamed him for any of this. "Father, it doesn't matter what we have lost. The important thing is that now we have time. And I've also been thinking about the future. I still don't know what I want, but I'm starting to understand that I can dream of something different." Charles smiled, extending his hand to his son. "You'll find out, Thomas. And when you find out, I will be by your side, as I always have been." Thomas squeezed his father's hand, feeling grateful for everything that had changed in the last few months. It was a new beginning, one he had never anticipated. As he thought about the future, for the first time in a long time, he felt like he could be anything he wanted. The following days were marked by family meetings and conversations about the past and plans for the future. Robert made a point of being present, creating increasingly stronger bonds with Thomas and Charles. The relationship between them grew every day, and, little by little, the scars of the past were being healed. Thus, a new life began to form, with hope, possibilities, and, above all, with the certainty that the family, even if distant for so long, always finds a way to reunite. The days continued to pass, and as time passed, the pieces of Thomas's life seemed to finally fall into place. His father, Charles, was visibly stronger, almost fully recovered from the illness that had threatened to take him from Thomas. Treatment at Robert's hospital was working in an exemplary manner, and the relationship between the two brothers was growing stronger every day. Thomas, in turn, followed his routine at school, now more confident and integrated into the environment. Aurora continued to be his loyal friend, always by his side, and the prejudiced looks that previously pursued him began to transform into respect. However, something still bothered Thomas: conversations about his family's past. The stories that his father and Robert told, little by little, like pieces of an unfinished puzzle, wouldn't leave him alone. There were gaps in the narrative of memories that didn't make sense to him. Who was your mother? Why didn't they ever talk about her? Thomas had never asked directly, but now, with the revelations about his uncle and the family reunion, he felt like this was an important missing piece. One peaceful afternoon, Thomas was on the porch of his house, looking at the sky. Charles, who was beginning to resume his routine with more vigor, came over and sat down next to his son. The silence between them was comfortable, but Thomas felt that the time had come to ask the question that was bothering him. "Father," Thomas began, his voice low but firm. "I know I never asked this, but what about my mother? Who was she? Why don't we ever talk about her?" Charles seemed to freeze for a moment. The question he had probably feared for so many years had finally been asked. His eyes, which had once been filled with joy at his recovery, now showed an old heaviness, a pain he had carried in silence for too long. He sighed deeply, as if gathering the strength to speak. "Thomas," began Charles, looking at the horizon. "Your mother was the most special person I have ever met. When we met, our lives were different. I still worked as a mechanic, and she was, well, she was a woman full of dreams and light. We quickly fell in love, and, shortly after, you were born. It was the happiest time of my life." Thomas watched his father carefully, feeling a mix of emotions. He could see the pain on Charles's face, but he also noticed the genuine love in his words. "But what happened to her? Why was she never here?" Charles closed his eyes for a moment, as if he needed to prepare himself for what was coming next. "Your mother got sick, Thomas, just like me. But her case was much more serious. She fought for a long time, but we couldn't save her. I was alone with you, and I never knew how to deal with this loss well. That's why we never talked about her. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because the pain was too great." Thomas felt a lump in his throat when he heard that. A part of him had always known that his mother's absence had a painful reason, but hearing the truth straight from his father was like an opening wound. "Daddy, why didn't you ever tell me this before? I could have understood somehow." Charles looked at his son, his eyes watering with regret. "I know, Thomas, and I'm sorry about that. I was so focused on protecting you from pain that I forgot that you had a right to know. I thought that by not talking about it I would be sparing you, but now I see that I was wrong." Thomas placed his hand on his father's, trying to comfort him. "You didn't make a mistake, Dad. I understand. I just think I always felt the lack of something without knowing what it was." The two remained silent for a moment longer, as the afternoon shadows lengthened on the ground. The wind gently swayed the leaves of the trees, bringing a feeling of peace, even with the heavy revelations that had just been made. "She would be so proud of you," said Charles, breaking the silence. "You have her strength and the courage to face adversity. I always knew you were special from the day you were born." Thomas felt tears welling up in his eyes, but he held them back. "I didn't want to cry, not now. Thank you, Dad. I wish I had known her better." Charles nodded, understanding his son's pain. "I'll tell you more about her, Thomas. Anything you want to know? I think I've hidden that part of our story for too long. While father and son were talking, Robert arrived at the house with a slight smile on his face. He realized that something important had happened, but he didn't want to interrupt. He just joined them on the porch, feeling the family connection grow even more. "Is everything okay here?" asked Robert, sitting down next to Charles and Thomas. Charles smiled, his eyes still shining with emotion. "Yes, Robert. We're just talking about the past. I think it's time to tell Thomas our whole story." Robert nodded, understanding the weight of that conversation. "This is important. Charles, Thomas deserves to know everything, and I think this will help us all move forward." Thomas looked at his uncle and father, feeling like, for the first time, all the pieces were falling into place: his mother, his uncle, his father. The story of his life, which previously seemed full of gaps and mysteries, began to unfold before his eyes. There was still a lot to be said, many stories to be told, but at that moment, Thomas felt he was on the right path. The scars of the past, although deep, were finally beginning to heal, and with that, he felt stronger than ever to face the future, no longer alone but surrounded by those who truly mattered. The conversation about Thomas and his mother's past brought a new sense of understanding and unity to the family. Charles fulfilled his promise to tell everything he knew, revealing details about the life of Grace, Thomas's mother. He described her vibrant personality, her love of art and music, and how she brightened the lives of everyone around her. Thomas listened to each word carefully, imagining that woman he had never met but now felt so close to. There was an inescapable sadness, but also a comfort in knowing more about her story. As the days passed, Charles continued to improve, and the house, once filled with worry and silence, now buzzed with talk about the future. Robert was a constant presence, and the bonds between him, Charles, and Thomas grew every day. Aurora also remained by Thomas's side, and together they faced the challenges and uncertainties of adolescence. However, with revelations from the past, Thomas began to feel a growing desire to better understand his mother, and this led him to want to know more about his origins. There was something in his story that he still felt was missing, one last piece that didn't fit. He knew his father had told him everything he knew, but Thomas felt there was more. One day, while Robert was talking to Charles in the living room, Thomas took courage and approached Aurora during a break at school. They were sitting in the courtyard, where the sun was shining brightly, contrasting with the feeling of mystery that still hung over Thomas. Aurora began to speak, idly fidgeting with the straps of her backpack. "I've been thinking a lot about my mother lately, about everything my father told me, but I think there's still something missing, you know? I feel like I don't know the whole story." Aurora looked at him with a look of concern but also empathy. She knew how much these questions weighed on Thomas and how his uncle's recent discovery had already changed his life so much. "Do you think your father didn't tell you everything?" she asked, leaning closer, showing that she was fully attentive. "That's not it," replied Thomas, shaking his head. "I believe what he said, but I think there's more about my mother that he doesn't know. Maybe something she never told him." Aurora was silent for a moment, processing Thomas's words. "I want to find out what happened," he said, with a deep sigh. "I feel like if I know more about her, I'll understand who I am better." Thoughtfully, Aurora asked, "And how do you plan to do that? What do you think remains to be discovered?" Thomas looked at the horizon, trying to organize his thoughts. "I don't know for sure. Maybe documents, photos, or someone who knew her before she met my father. Who knows, maybe there's something that could help me understand what really happened to her." Determined to help her friend, Aurora thought for a moment and suggested, "How about we start with the places where she lived? If we look for where she was before meeting her father, maybe we can find someone who knows more about her." The idea made sense to Thomas. He had never ventured to explore his mother's past beyond what Charles had told him, but perhaps there were people or places that could reveal more about the woman she was. "That's a good idea," Thomas replied, feeling a spark of hope. I'm going to talk to my dad tonight. See if he remembers anything. That night, at dinner, Thomas felt the time had come to approach Charles about his new intentions. Robert was in the house, as always, and everyone seemed relaxed after a long day. Taking advantage of the relaxed atmosphere, Thomas introduced the topic. Dad, I was thinking about Mom. Do you remember where she lived before you two met? Or if she had any close friends back then? Charles stopped eating and looked at his son, surprised by the question. He was silent for a moment, reflecting. She lived in a small town, not too far from here. I think the name was Santa Cruz. That's where we met, at one of those neighborhood fairs. You know, she didn't talk much about her life before me, but she mentioned that she had friends there. Good people. Thomas nodded, mentally registering the information. Santa Cruz, that would be the next step. If my mother had friends or acquaintances there, maybe they could give some clue as to what I'm looking for. Robert, who had remained silent until then, looked at Thomas with interest. If you want, I can help you look for more information, Robert suggested. I know some people who can help us look for old records or locate people from that era. Thomas smiled, feeling that he was not alone in this quest. I would really appreciate it, Uncle. I think it's time to find out everything I can. So, with the support of Aurora, Charles, and Robert, Thomas prepared to embark on a new journey. The search for answers about her mother wasn't just about filling in gaps in the past, it was about finding his place in the world and understanding the roots that connected him to who he was today. In the following days, preparations took over the group. Robert used his contacts to locate old Santa Cruz documents, while Thomas and Aurora began planning a trip to the city. Charles, although worried about what Thomas might find, fully supported his son. I knew that this search was important and that, in a way, it could help heal the wounds left by the past. Finally, the day of the trip arrived. Thomas, Aurora, and Robert left for Santa Cruz, carrying with them the hope that, at the end of that journey, they would not only find the answers they were looking for but also a new understanding of Grace's life. She, the woman who, despite being absent, still exerted a profound influence on everyone. Sitting in the back seat of Robert's car, Thomas looked at the road ahead. I felt a mixture of excitement and anxiety, but also a sense of peace. He knew that no matter what he encountered, he was surrounded by family, by people who cared about him and would support him unconditionally. With that thought, he prepared to face whatever was waiting for him in Santa Cruz. When they arrived in the city late in the afternoon, Thomas, Aurora, and Robert came across a small place with quiet streets and old houses. Some still had exposed brick facades, while others had been renovated but maintained the charm of times gone by. Thomas observed the place with curiosity, trying to imagine his mother walking through those streets, laughing with friends, living the life he never knew. Something inside him seemed to calm down when he saw the scenery that was once part of her life. The three stayed in a small inn in the city center. Robert soon started making calls, activating the contacts he had followed in the last few days. He knew that finding people who still remembered Grace wouldn't be easy, but he was determined to help Thomas find out everything he could. Meanwhile, Aurora and Thomas walked through the streets of Santa Cruz, feeling the city's welcoming atmosphere. "It's strange being here, isn't it?" said Aurora, as they passed through a square full of trees and wooden benches. "Knowing that your mother lived here and that, in some way, you are connected to all of this." Thomas nodded, looking around. "I feel like I'm closer to her now, even though I don't have all the answers. Just being here, it feels like I'm getting to know a part of her that I never had a chance to see." They continued walking until an elderly man, sitting on one of the benches in the square, caught Thomas's attention. The man wore a straw hat and looked at them curiously. "You're not from around here, are you?" he asked, with a voice full of kindness. "No, sir," Thomas replied politely. "Actually, I'm looking for information about someone who lived here a long time ago. My mother, Grace. She lived here before I was born." The old man frowned thoughtfully. Grace, the name is familiar. There was a girl named Grace who lived here, yes, many years ago. If I'm not mistaken, she was known for being very kind and was always surrounded by friends. But suddenly, she went away, and no one heard from her again. Are you her son? Thomas felt a tightness in his chest when he heard those words. Yes, it's me. I never knew her very well, she passed away when I was little. The elderly man nodded, his face reflecting understanding. What a shame, son. She was a good woman. But you're in the right place. If you want to know more about her, maybe you should look for Donna Estella, a close friend of your mother's. She still lives here, in the house on the corner, so there, he pointed to a house with low walls and large windows. Thomas thanked the man and looked at Aurora with an expectant look. Miss Estella, maybe she knows more about my mother's story. They headed towards the indicated house. When they reached the door, Thomas took a deep breath before knocking. A lady with gray hair and a kind smile answered the door. His eyes lit up when Thomas explained who he was. Are you Grace's son? She asked, her voice trembling with emotion. Come on in. We have a lot to talk about. Inside Donna Estella's house, the walls were decorated with old photos and objects that seemed to hold memories of a lifetime. She led them into the living room, where they sat in comfortable armchairs. Aurora and Thomas listened intently as the lady began to tell stories about Grace. Grace was my best friend, said Donna Estella, with a distant look. She was a free spirit, always so full of life. We met when we were young and we never left each other until the day she left. I remember she was very happy when she met her father, Thomas, but there was something about her, a secret she never shared with me. Thomas felt his heart speed up. A secret? What do you mean? Donna Estella sighed, crossing her hands in her lap. I never knew exactly what it was, but sometimes Grace seemed distant, like she was carrying a burden. She talked little about her family, about the past, but I felt there was something more. When she got sick, it was even more difficult, she closed herself off. And before leaving for the big city with you and your father, she told me something that I never forgot. Aurora leaned in, curious, and Thomas could barely breathe with anticipation. What did she say? Donna Estella looked into Thomas's eyes, her voice low and serious. She told me that if you ever came to me looking for answers, I should give you these. The lady got up slowly and walked to an antique dresser, opening a drawer carefully. From there, he took out a small, delicately decorated wooden box. This was your mother's, said Donna Estella, handing the box to Thomas. She never told me what it contained, but she asked me to keep it for you. Thomas picked up the box carefully, feeling the weight of the moment. He looked at Aurora, who encouraged him. With shaking hands, he opened the lid. Inside, he found a letter and an old photograph of his mother, young and smiling. He took a deep breath and began to read the letter in silence. The letter was a farewell written by Grace shortly before her death. In it, she talked about the love she felt for Thomas and Charles, but she also revealed something that Thomas didn't expect. Before meeting Charles, Grace had faced great difficulties with her own family. The letter mentioned a complicated situation that Grace had never overcome, but that she hoped that Thomas, by knowing his own story, would find the strength to move forward without carrying the same burdens. Thomas felt tears run down his face as he read his mother's words, finally understanding the depth of the pain she had carried. But along with the pain came a sense of relief and closure. Now he knew who she really was, and it gave him a new perspective on his own life. Aurora placed her hand on Thomas's shoulder, comforting him. Now you have the missing piece. Thomas nodded, feeling a peace he had never felt before. He put the letter and photograph back in the box, knowing that, in some way, his mother was always with him, guiding him, even in the shadows of her absence. When they returned to the inn, Robert was waiting for them, eager to know what they had discovered. Thomas told everything, and Robert moved and hugged his nephew. "Now you have all the answers, Thomas. And your mother would be proud of the man you've become." Thomas smiled, feeling lighter than ever. He had faced the past and was now ready to move forward, with his family by his side and the knowledge that no matter what happened, he would carry his parents' legacy with him. The cycle was complete, the past had been unraveled, and the future now seemed full of possibilities. The story of Thomas, Charles, Robert, and Grace was finally at peace. Did you like today's story? So leave your like, subscribe to our channel, and activate the notification bell. By doing so, you won't miss our next video.